Well, welcome back to another episode of the Electric Bison. I'm pretty excited today. We get to have my friend Randy Lecoq again. I hope you were at the last episode where we talked about his background as a Foreign Service officer for 25 years, just basically getting paid to run all over the place in Russia and Africa and the Middle East, working on different things like the Camp David Accords, and then a lot of things in Russia that we were able to touch on, as well as in Africa. And we'll get to him in a minute, but before we start, one of the things that came up in our visit last week, as I mentioned that I had gone to Germany with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment for a return of forces to Germany exercise. And the 3rd Armored Cavalry flew over to Frankfurt, Germany. We had our guns between our knees on the plane, got off, drew our tanks, put them up on tank cars, on flat cars, and then went up to the Czechoslovakian border and began a series of exercises that lasted for a couple of weeks with the 3rd Armored Division and the 8th Infantry Division. The reason I got into that is I was just minding my own business up here in Montana when there was a request for a senior armor captain, and there were three others of us. They were real capable sergeants in the Montana Guard, and they wanted us to go down to Fort Bliss and marry up with 3rd Armored Cav. And at the time I was an armored company, a tank company commander. I had been for a couple of years, Company D of the 163rd Armored Cavalry. So it was an opportunity to learn something, and I did. But when I went down there to join up with the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment, I took the opportunity to cross over from El Paso to Juarez, Ciudad Juarez, and take a Mexican Airlines flight down into Mexico City. And it was my first chance to go to Mexico City, and I didn't want to pass it up. And I was sitting on the flagpole there in the Zocalo in front of the presidential palace, and minding my own business, but I could see a soldier was going to kick me off in a short time. So I got ready to get off where I was sitting, and an old guy who had been working in a shoe factory in Belize when the British had it, British Honduras, came by and he says to me, "You're Norte Americano, aren't you?" And I said, "Well, yeah, I am." like he couldn't tell. And he says, "How would you like to come and see my house?" And I thought, well, this is a great opportunity, and I don't have to learn to speak Spanish better than I do. And he seemed like a nice gentleman. He had a shoe hanging out of his briefcase. He had an old leather briefcase. He was old as the hills. He was older than Randy and I are now. But anyhow, he says, "Well, come on." So we went and we got on a bus. Went out of the Zocalo and got on a bus, and we drove for a long time. And we ended up by the Basilica of Our Lady of Guadalupe, and went past that, and then got off the bus and went across some tracks up onto what looked like a giant garbage dump. And it was just teeming with people. And he took me up, he wanted to show me his house. And I said, "Yeah, I'd like to see it." So we went up about 5 layers. You'd go up, and then there'd be a street, and you'd go up, and there'd be a street, and there'd be a cantina on each corner with chicken wire, and they're selling orange pop, and lots of people. It reminded me of Corktown in Butte, where the Irish mining families all lived with one address back in the day, 700 families in shanties. And all the people were dressed very nicely as they went into town, but it was pretty basic living conditions. He showed me his house. It was an adobe house. It was just a square structure. You had to step up on a boulder, go through a wooden door, had one light bulb, but it was the nicest house on the hill. He said he'd almost talked the 69-year-old woman into marrying him, but she didn't want to climb up to his house. I really got a kick out of that. And when we went up to his house, there was a woman with a baby at her breast laying under a tin shack that was put together by screws through upside-down bottle caps. It was very basic. But it was real insight into how people coming in from the country into Mexico City were living. And we had a really good conversation. He showed me his sewing machine, and he wanted me to see the view of the Mexico City airport. But we had a long talk, and he was a really knowledgeable man, and about whether or not the Mexican Revolution had been complete yet. He felt that the students had to be more involved and so forth. But during that process, he introduced me to a whole lot of people, including people that came and went over our southern border to go to work in the States and then come back. And I was really impressed. The people, this was 1984, they were really nice people. And when I was down at the Basilica for Our Lady of Guadalupe, the Mexican people would come in on their knees from a long distance, on their knees across the cobblestones to come to the Milagrosa. So it's really bothered me all these years, especially since President Trump has become our mouthpiece, when he talks about people coming up from the southern border who are murderers and rapists and criminals. That's a lie. And it's never been publicly challenged, and I'm publicly challenging it right now. It's wrong. And furthermore, after 1984, I got more interested in what happened when we invaded Mexico. As General Ulysses Grant said, you know, we wanted to invade Mexico, but we needed to have them do something to us first. And we had a president, President Polk, who was a slave owner, and he wanted to bring Texas, which was a slave state, into the Union. And then he wanted to bring the other states that would become part of Mexico, were part of Mexico then, into the Union. And so, as slave states, that never worked out, but we got a bunch of states. We got 55% of the territory of Mexico at the time. You know, it's now Utah, California, Arizona, New Mexico. And we did that by precipitating a war. And the first couple episodes about that war, I start with about episode 38 and go on till about 50, where I talk about the press that we had in those days up in Boston and Philadelphia and New York and Baltimore, and how they would have to get their stories after 2 weeks from down here because the heart of the press, the war press, was down in New Orleans. And the different papers and the penny press, it was called, and the kids were selling it for a penny a piece, you know, read all about it and so forth. And how the pro-war press was down in New Orleans and everybody else kind of depended on it. And that was a time when Lincoln was a congressman. And he was really upset when we sent an army of observation that was up at Corpus Christi, sent them down across the disputed territory. Texas was claiming land that the Mexicans said wasn't part of Texas. And then he, when we got to El Fronton, which was at the mouth of the Rio Grande or Rio Bravo from the Mexicans' point of view, we burned the town down. He was really upset about that we would do that. And then what happened, and this was at a time when the Irish famine was ongoing, and the Irish people coming off the boats from Europe were basically not welcome. And but the one choice they had was to be in the military. So half of the army, over half the army that invaded Mexico at Polk's discretion were Irishmen and were immigrants, and more than half of the immigrants in that army were Irishmen. The other half were mostly Germans. There were some Swiss and some French, but that was pretty much the laydown. And Sam Grant, when he was an officer out of West Point that was in that army, he said there was never a better army man for man that ever marched into another country. However, when he became president of the United States after the Civil War, he's the only president, the only person we've ever had that I know of or could find record of who came close to apologizing to the Mexicans for invading their country and stealing 55% of it. Now that's ridiculous. And what he said was, never in history has there been a case of a superior military force invading a country with a less strong military force, but he never apologized. So since, May 8th is the 179th anniversary of our first battle, which happened at Palo Alto. What happened was Zachary Taylor took his people down to the mouth of the Rio Grande, and on the way back, the Mexicans tried to stop them. They lost the battle. They lost a lot of people, and then the next day was the Battle of Resaca de la Palma, and quite a few of them drowned trying to cross the Rio Grande. The Rio Grande was about 200 yards wide. It had steamboats in it. It was a big river, and but what had happened is we declared war after those two battles. We declared war on May 13th, and that's because there had been an earlier skirmish with a guy named Thornton, Captain Thornton. Some of his dragoons got killed by the Mexicans, and that was the reason given for us going to war. The Thornton affair. It's kind of like the Gulf of Tonkin incident, if you remember that. We needed a reason, and so we did that. The report went from the Thornton affair up to Washington, and it got there just as President Taylor was declaring war. And then he had a reason. He was going to use a different reason. And so May is a big month between us and the Mexicans. That's when we did the deed. We did the deed. And it's really shameful. And I'm really sorry that we did that. And I think some of the earlier episodes that talk about what happened with the Irish soldiers, how they were being treated because they were immigrants, plus what will happen later in September when we talk about the Battle of Monterrey, and next February when we talk about the Battle of Buena Vista or Angostura, and then later on when we talk about the battles of Cerro Gordo and Contreras and Churubusco, where the Irishmen who had left the American army were fighting for the Mexicans. They were known as the San Patricios, or the Legión la Extranjera, the Foreign Legion. But they put up quite a fight at Churubusco, and then during that 2-week armistice, because both sides took such a beating in that fight, the leader, who had crossed over before we said the hostilities had started, his name was John Riley, he was court-martialed. And he was 50 of them got hung, 50 of the survivors. There was probably 250 to 700 San Patricios, but he didn't get hung because he had crossed over earlier in April to go to Easter Mass, and during his court-martial, when Colonel Bennett asked him, why did you cross the river? And he said, I had an urge to go to Mass. Well, it's not, I don't want to make these people bigger than what they were, but I think that's exactly what he was doing. And then the Mexicans got him, and then you can read the episode because he laid out what happened to him after that. When they hung the 50 San Patricios, the 50 American soldiers who fought for the other side because they did not like fighting for slavery, or they preferred the Catholic religion, or they were being treated better, whatever the reasons were. There was a combination. Of those that were hung, only 13 asked to be buried in sacred ground, by the Catholic priests down there. The rest are just buried. The rest are buried with their former American soldiers in the Mexico City Overseas Cemetery, which is ironic. But anyhow, I wanted to bring that up because May is a big time. And that caused me, you'll find when you listen to Randy and I talking that he's the diplomat. I'm not real diplomatic. But I decided to write a letter to the President of Mexico. And I wrote it May 7th, which would be the day before the anniversary of our first battle. And I said, Her Excellency Dr. Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo, President of the United Mexican States, Palacio Nacional, Ciudad de Mexico, Mexico. Your Excellency, please accept my sincere apology as a citizen of the United States for the war declared and the invasion of your country by my government in 1846. I also wish to express deep regret that the current President of the United States continues to make unchallenged public remarks referring to migrants from Mexico as rapists and murderers. During meaningful conversations I had in 1984 with transient residents on the hill of Chapec near Indios Verdes, I came to understand more deeply the dignity, resilience, and humanity of your people. To mischaracterize them in such a way is, in my view, a violation of the moral imperative not to bear false witness against our neighbors. Most North Americans feel as I do. I really believe that. Moreover, I want to express my profound gratitude to the people of Mexico for the humanitarian aid extended to my ancestors, the Driscolls, the Sullivan Greens, the Downeys, the Flanagans, the O'Mearas, and the Murphys during the Great Irish Famine. That generosity offered at a time when your own nation was enduring conflict with the United States is a testament to the enduring compassion and solidarity of the Mexican people. Lastly, if time permits, I respectfully invite you and your staff to consider listening to episodes 55 and 56 of my podcast, Electric Bison. I believe they help convey why I hope you might be willing to serve as a moral authority and trusted voice for peace in the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine. With highest respect and sincere hope for continued friendship between our peoples, I remain sincerely Colonel Retired John B. Driscoll. So I did that, and it's done. So what we're going to talk about today is the other side of this, Africa. And I spent a lot of time working on Africa, probably one of very few. Instead of going to Vietnam, they kept me here in the States, and I ended up doing strategic intelligence analysis on Africa. And when time came for me to ship out for Vietnam, I'd been to the infantry school in combat intelligence. I didn't get orders. They sent everybody else, and they kept me here. And so I did handbooks of military forces and order of battle handbooks for the 82nd Airborne Division and the 3rd Special Forces Group in the 18th Airborne Corps. And the first country was Mozambique. It was a Portuguese colony, long time, hundreds of years old. And then Angola, another Portuguese colony. And then up here, Guinea-Bissau, they had the PAIGC there. And generally, I was responsible for a lot of these countries, for getting the reports out on the different countries. And but at the time in Mozambique, there was an insurgency called Frelimo, and it was pretty well along by 1970. This was 1970. I got out. This was 1970, 71, 72, and so Mozambique didn't get its independence from Portugal until about 1974. But while I was watching this, I had access to all kinds of information coming in that you wouldn't believe. I mean, when the Pentagon Papers came out, I had a Department of Army civilian that asked me if we should put the New York Times into the classified reading room, right? It was just a weird time. Well, I had all these information reports coming in from this part of the world from all kinds of sources. I won't go into that, but they would be graded on how reliable the sources was, how reliable the information. They would use that to make these order of battle handbooks and handbooks of military forces. What happened with me is I was kept in Fort Bragg it was called the Continental Army Command Tactical Intelligence Center, but it was really strategic intelligence. I was kept there to follow 13 insurgencies. That's what we called them in those days. It wasn't terrorism, it was insurgencies. There were a couple in Mozambique. There was, I think, 3 in Angola. The Zimbabwe African People's Union and Zimbabwe African People's Front were in Zambia. African National Congress, that's Mandela's crew. They were operating down into South Africa. And then there were many others, up the PAIGC up in Portuguese Guinea. We talked about Ethiopia last week. I debriefed a special forces team from the 3rd Special Forces Group that came back from Ethiopia. That was a bad scene over there. And there were others. But my point is that I was involved. I mean, I know where Africa is. I know where Mozambique is. I'm telling you where it is now in Angola. And as I left, I had to switch over to work on Vietnam from the States because the spring offensive was taking place in 1972, and fire bases were falling left and right. Remember the people on the embassy roof, all that stuff. I got into that. But one of the things that happened is, as I was phasing myself out, I was monitoring meetings between the intelligence people from the Republic of South Africa, which was apartheid. It was a white-controlled country then. And from Rhodesia, which is what the old name of Zimbabwe was, white Rhodesia. And then the Portuguese army. And what we were doing, we, the United States, we would do things like make sure the Portuguese had Boeing 707 so that they could move rifle companies from up here, down to here, over to here, up to there, back and forth, use their limited resources better. And also road graders, because their casualties were coming from mines being placed in dirt roads. So if you paved over the roads, it was less of an exposure. That's where I left, right? So that's where we're going to bring in Randy, because he got involved with Mozambique later, and I think it's really important. We can talk about the Camp David Accords later and Gaza and all that, a couple episodes from now, but what happened with Mozambique is most interesting to me because I think there's a template there that we might be able to use for Ukraine and Russia. And Randy, can you take it from there and tell us what happened?
Yeah, it was. It's really one of our success stories, I think.
Yeah.
The Civil War had been going on. They got their independence, like you say, in '74, '75, and then they were fighting a civil war between Frelimo and Renamo from 1980 until 1991, 92.
And Renamo was being supported by the white South Africans.
That's right.
Yeah.
And Frelimo, of course, at this time, they'd been in power for quite a while. And you have to remember in Zimbabwe that they had their independence in 1980. So, the whole 10 years that Mozambique was fighting the civil war between Frelimo and Renamo. Frelimo was a Marxist government. And that, of course, made South Africa nervous because they were supporting the ANC and the anti-apartheid forces in South Africa. And South Africa also felt pressured by, Cuban troops in Angola and so forth. So they felt a lot of pressure. And I think the United States felt at the time under Presidents Reagan and Bush Sr., about 1988, 89, we really got thinking about this. We thought, we're on a bit of a roll. Things have changed since you were working on this, John. And South Africa was changing, de Klerk was coming in, and Botha was out. And on the Namibia and Angola front, Chester Crocker had worked out a deal with Kenneth Kaunda of Zambia and Lusaka, where they would have peace talks, and it would be sequential. The Cubans would get their troops out of Angola, and South Africa would remove their troops from Namibia. And so things were working out pretty well. You remember that time period, 88, 89, it was going well everywhere. I mean, Eastern Europe was becoming free, the Warsaw Pact. Yeltsin was in Russian Federation. So there was a real trend toward kind of peace in the world at that time. There was a change, kind of a cultural change a little bit. And South Africa was liberalizing. And so I think the United States thought that where I come into this, I became the Mozambique desk officer in 1988 for 3 years.
You were in Washington?
In Washington, D.C. in the State Department. I was the guy that was the point man for Mozambique in the Africa Bureau. And the Africa Bureau was under Chester Crocker and then later Hank Cohen and Chester Crocker had been my professor years ago at Georgetown before I went in the State Department. And we decided, the United States decided, after President Chissano took over in Mozambique, and Samora Machel, you remember, he died in the airplane incident.
Yeah.
And the United States thought that Chissano had been educated in Zurich. He was a doctor, and he was a different type of guy, and he was moderating Mozambique by 1988. And he was trying to, because they had been a one-party state under Frelimo, a Marxist government, socialist, and he wanted to moderate things a little bit to help the economy and to get rid of the stalemate, the 10-year civil war with Renamo has been going on so long. Neither side was winning. And I think he felt like he couldn't win this war, maybe. A lot of the villagers were turning against the government. And so, just like the thing that was happening in Eastern Europe, where the people were throwing off the Marxist socialist regimes, and the same thing in Mozambique. And And so the United States decided, well, maybe we can take advantage of this trend in the region with South Africa under de Klerk and Mandela and so forth. And maybe we can even make South Africa more accommodating, feeling less threatened, if we can get Mozambique to become more democratic. And Chissano, who came to Washington, D.C. under the Reagan administration, made a very good impression. And he went back, and everybody said, you know, this is a very interesting guy, this Chissano. He might be for real. He seems to want to maybe moderate or at least democratize a bit. We might have an opportunity here to step in, and maybe we can't mediate an end to this war between Renamo and Frelimo, which was really brutal. Renamo was really very brutal in the way they carried on this war. When they would take over a village, they take all the people out. They would literally nail people to trees, and they would make the children set fire to the houses that their parents were in, and so forth. And that's a whole nother story about how we brought people in from Duke University to work with these catatonic kids and get them back to normal. But so we thought we have to do something about this terrible war too, on a humanitarian basis for human rights. I mean, this Renamo is just so brutal and so terrible, and the government, of course, is not helping the situation by not dealing with this insurgency properly in the proper way, perhaps. So South Africa is involved in supporting Renamo. We know that they seem to be supporting them with ammunition, weapons, command and control, intelligence, communications equipment. Renamo was pretty well equipped for that type of an insurgency. And so that's how we got involved. We got to thinking, you know, maybe there's a chance for peace here. And we had an ambassador, Melissa Wells, out there who had spent years working with the United Nations. And she was wonderful, and she was all over Mozambique, all over the countryside. By the time she left Mozambique, when I left later on, a lot of the young girls in that country were named Melissa, after Melissa
great.
Wells. She was everybody in the Foreign Service knew Melissa Wells, knew how wonderful she was. She was really an inspiration. I was her desk officer, so I was her point person in the State Department, and she was a friend. So, so we got involved, just like we got involved in trying to mediate in Angola and elsewhere. The point here is that we thought that maybe it had to be a matter of timing, and Melissa was close to the Vatican. She had contacts with the Vatican because she traveled around Mozambique. There was a war going on, so it was dangerous to travel around the countryside. But she traveled all over to the villages, and she met with the people, and she found out that the people who had contacts with both sides, with the government and with the rebels, were the missionaries out there in the countryside, and mainly the Catholic Church, and mainly an organization called Sant'Egidio, which is a humanitarian support system under Vatican II that tries to help people in working out. The priests actually work out in the fields with the people and have these little small parish churches and so forth. Of course, the Archbishop in Beira, Mozambique, is also involved. But Melissa said, you know, I think that the people that can mediate this war, the people that are trusted by both sides, they have contacts with both sides, is Sant'Egidio.
And that means St. Giles, right?
I don't know.
Yeah, I think it does.
I think it does.
Yeah.
Yeah, St. Giles was involved in other peace negotiations too, right? In the Middle
I mean,
East.
it was out of Rome.
Yes, that's right. Yeah. So basically, they got this thing rolling, and they thought, well, okay, we're going to give it a shot. But first, before we do it, we're going to go around and we're going to ask everybody if the United States decides to play a facilitating role. What we have in mind is the Vatican, Sant'Egidio in Rome, in the Vatican, will, in Santa Maria Church, 13th century church in Trastevere, that there's a guy named Don Matteo Zutti, who is their priest with Mozambique connections. He will sit down and he will sit at the table for the inside track, where we'll have Renamo and Frelimo sitting at the table with Don Matteo sitting in the middle, mediating. The Vatican can mediate because they know the situation on the ground. They're trusted by both sides. And maybe it's just a shot, we can do it. And what we'll do is that the United States will play a facilitating role. We'll be the outer ring. We'll be there too, sitting at the back of the table, in the back of the room. And if anybody needs help, either side, we will do it. We can provide resources. We can maybe organize an international donors conference to rebuild that country. We can make sure that media keeps the focus on the place, that if either side gets out of line, the international media will be on them. And we even put out a report called the Gersony Report. Renamo was getting a little bit too frisky, a little bit too much support, and even though they're doing these atrocities. So we put out the Gersony Report. We hired a guy, Robert Gersony, to come in, and he was like Carnegie Foundation type of guy. He did a report, neutral, and it really outlined Renamo's atrocities and put them on their back legs a little bit then. And because they were starting to get some support in the United States too among conservative circles. But we didn't mind them that necessarily having that, but we didn't want it to go too far. We wanted to have be a balanced picture and to keep the pressure on them because they were starting to say, oh, we don't need to negotiate, we're going to win this war, you know. So anyway, the Gersony Report set them back a bit because all their supporters, we looked at the equities. Okay, who's going to, our job on the outer ring is to keep the pressure on both sides, on Renamo and Frelimo, by their supporters. The Italian government had tremendous investment in with the government of Mozambique. A lot of resources in there, on both sides actually. The CSU in Germany, for some reason, had some contacts too with both sides, Strauss. Then there had Kiplagat, who was the primary aide to President Moi in Kenya, who had been a priest and was a priest. And he had contacts with Renamo and was close to them. So we could use him to do that. Zimbabwe, Dhlakama, the leader of Renamo, was actually from a small tribe related to the Shoa tribe in Zimbabwe, which is what Mugabe is part of, is Shoa and Ndebele, Shoa in particular. So we found out there's a tribal aspect to this insurgency of Renamo. And it's connected a little bit to Zimbabwe and to the Shoa and southern tribes in Mozambique, which are related. Well, as far as we know, there's a guy named Cameron Hume, who was our DCM in the Vatican, who wrote a book on this called Ending Mozambique's War. Wonderful. Cameron was great. He was our representative at the peace talks. So, so we're going to use the outer ring, and we're going to get those people supporting Frelimo to put pressure on Frelimo to say, you got to democratize a little bit more. You got to give Renamo a little bit. You can't just say that they're terrorists and bandits and don't deserve you don't deserve to sit down at the table with them. You got to be more open-minded. You got to be willing to give a little democracy, get away from your socialism. Renamo will not sit down at the table with you if you don't. And so then we get the other people who are supporting Renamo, like the South Africans, maybe Zimbabwe, but Zimbabwe also liked Frelimo because Frelimo helped them in their war. So we found all the people that we heard about that were supporting either side, and we went to them, including the Portuguese, who had a lot of farms out there, and so forth. Tea, sugar, tobacco, cotton. They were involved. The former colonial power, the metropole, although they're out now. And a little bit of them bitter too, some of them. And so we went to Lisbon, talked to them. So our job was, when we found out that somebody's maybe obstructing the peace process, well, we go talk to them. That's what the United States does. We also have experience in peace talks. I mean, Good Friday Accords, Camp David in Israel, 1979. Dealing with China with a one China policy, dealing with Germany and NATO reunification when Gorbachev didn't like it. We had to tell him that under Helsinki, countries can choose their own allies. So we have a lot of experience on how to deal with different issues. And we had military, so we had guys like John from the Pentagon who are experts in this area, Charlie Snyder and Greg Bradford, and they worked with us on Liberia and on that civil war. I was over there. But so Bradford came in and said, here's what we do in other countries. You got a lot of these boy soldiers all over the place and a lot of the militias. So we created a national army, and part of the peace package is we'll create a national army and let them both join the army and get salaries and be soldiers. And this is some of the ideas that we know how to do, set things up. We also know how to do power sharing. Federalism, we know about, of course, about democracy. So we have value added. We can put in at the table if we need to. If they want ideas, Renamo came up with a 16-point plan that they wouldn't even go to the table in the Vatican to talk to Frelimo unless it was on the basis of their peace plan, which they thought was like Thomas Jefferson's plan, representative democracy. Frelimo said, no, we have a 12-point plan, which is based on more of a Marxist or a participatory democracy, although moderated. 12 points, and we're not going to sit down with these bandits unless they agree to this as the basis of talks. So we came up, the United States sat down and drafted the two, merged the two together, participatory and representative democracy, threw in a little bit of power sharing from Belgium, the Walloons and the Flemings and so forth, and came up with a 7-point plan that merged these. We're going to have representative democracy, but we'll also have, they can have a few mass organizations, and we're going to throw in some federalism, because we know some of these provinces in Mozambique, some of the counties out there, are actually the people like Renamo, and they're related tribally to Renamo. We found this out. And so what we're going to do is, under our peace treaty, we'll have to have, Renamo has to have, even if they lose the elections, there'll be elections, of course. If they lose the elections, well, they still get a certain number of portfolios. Maybe they get the Ministry of Education. Maybe they get the Vice Presidency. Maybe they're the President of the Parliament. They're promised in advance, no matter what the vote, you're going to have representation. And you're also going to be able to, on a local level, mainly control those provinces where you're popular, on the Malawian and Zimbabwe border, for example. These are things we do, things we know, we think we know. And it worked out pretty well. But so we had a lot of ideas, and we kept the media pressure on both sides. We can do that as the United States. We can keep the media pressure on. We can come up with military, how to create a national army. We do all that. And so we had all these ideas, and we knew we could help. And we met secretly with Dhlakama, with the head of Renamo, even though we had said we wouldn't meet with them. We finally agreed to, with Jesse Helms, that we would have a person go out and meet with Dhlakama. It's okay, we'll talk to everybody, even though we didn't want to give them a lot of moral support until they deserved it because of the atrocities. So they sent a guy named Ed Puget. He was our charge in Zimbabwe, knew the area. He was also a former helicopter pilot in Vietnam, and fearless, and a really sharp guy. And I went with him. So the two of us went out to Nairobi and met Dhlakama in a hotel room and talked to him. We gave him our 7-point plan. He tore it up and threw it in our faces. And you know, they were a dangerous group. They were kind of scary guys. And I told Ed afterwards, I said, Ed, because we were going to meet him originally out in the bush in his headquarters in Gorongosa in Mozambique. And we finally decided, no, we'll go and do it instead in Nairobi. It might be a little safer.
That's smart.
And he had temper, and he took our 7-point plan and just tore it up and threw the pieces of paper right in our faces. And I looked at Ed and I said, glad we didn't go to Gorongosa, Ed. But he said, I've been in worse. You've been in worse.
Yeah.
So
You have to.
yeah, it worked out well. And it's kind of funny. So we basically, I may be saying too much about it.
No, that's
well,
excellent.
we basically, then we decided, Chet Crocker and Hank Cohen, decided, well, we have to go around and find out if people are receptive to our idea that we could be a facilitator, and if there's any hope for peace in that country. Let's go talk to the region, talk to the experts. So we did. We had an assistant secretary under Crocker and Cohen named Chaz Freeman. Later became our ambassador in South Africa. A real character, a sharp guy. And Crocker had wonderful people working for him, Frank Wisner and Chaz Freeman and so forth. So Chaz Freeman and I went out, and we went to see Mugabe, talked to him, said, what do you think? Is there any hope? Is there any hope? If we don't want to get involved unless it's going to be a win, right? And he actually said, yeah, you know, he said both sides are a little bit tired of the war, and the villagers are starting to create self-defense forces of their own to save to the army from both sides that comes into the villages, get out of here, and they started shooting at them and setting up perimeters. And so maybe the sides are getting the message that, you know, that people are tired of the war.
Yeah.
Maybe the time has come.
Yeah.
So Mugabe said also it is a little bit tribally based, and maybe we can help in that regard. So then we went over and talked to President Banda of Malawi, who's a brilliant man, classical scholar. I mean, one of my favorite guys. And talked to him, and we went to Tanzania, and we also talked to, we went to South Africa because they were supporting Renamo. We had to tell them, you need to stop supporting Renamo, put the squeeze on them. If they don't have the arms, they don't have the communications, the command and control and intelligence, communications, all the stuff, then they'll have to be more accommodating to super peace. So we went and met with the head in Pretoria. Well, first we went down to Cape Town and met with Pickbother, the foreign minister, at his house. And he was encouraging. And then we went to talk to the head of South African military intelligence in Pretoria. A very tough guy, big bore, great. But he was at first when we talked to him, he didn't want to really cooperate with us. He thought we were against them and they were supporting Renamo, and too bad about that, but they needed to. So he was a big guy, and Chaz Freeman said to him, he said, you know, we have information that you're providing. We all know South Africa is supporting Renamo. You're giving them all command and control, your ammunition, and all this stuff. And he said, really? He said, you have proof of this? And Chaz said to him, he said, who are you talking to? He said, we are the United States. We don't have to give you proof. We know everything. I was sitting there enjoying it. I couldn't believe it. I just couldn't believe it. And the guy looked for a minute and he thought, because he's a tough guy, you know.
Yeah.
And he thought, and he said, okay,
yeah.
Maybe we can help. And we said, well, what are they like? We hear that Chisano's moderate, that he's changing. They said, well, we don't know that. They're still calling Renamo bandits, saying they won't talk to him. I said, well, believe me, we know Chisano like you don't know him even. And we think there's a chance here, and we also think that people are getting tired of the war. He said, don't push that self-defense force stuff too far, because a lot of this insurgency is tribal-based. And so Renamo may have more of a strong base of support in those villages than you think they have. I mean, we're getting pretty good information from both sides. Didn't know if we were going to get out alive or not, but you know. But Chaz is a character. So then we told him, we said, look, we don't want to get involved unless there's a chance. Is there a chance with Renamo? These guys seem to be pretty rough. He said, I'll tell you something, they're not as ignorant and unsophisticated as you think they are. And they're pretty intelligent. And if they can get a decent level playing field, and if they think that Frelimo is playing fair and is serious, then you'd be surprised how far you can go. And I think we walked out there thinking, wow, you know.
Had you gone up to the Vatican yet, or to Rome?
Yeah, I didn't do that, but Melissa did that. Melissa set this whole thing up with the Vatican. She was a secretive person. She never even hardly told her desk officer, me, everything. She one time wanted to take a vacation, and it's probably all worked out with Crocker, I'm sure it was, and with Secretary Schultz. And she wanted to take a vacation, so her vacation just happened to be in Italy. And she came back and it was all wired, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah. But her experience working in the UN for many years paid off. So anyway, that's where it all got started. We went to, everybody sort of said, you know, it's just possible. And that's where I was there, you know, until 91, and then I went off to Russia. But, so I passed it on. I was at some of the negotiations in San Egidio, and I watched Don Matteo, and I watched the San Egidio working with these people, and it really is a grassroots thing. It's really grassroots. I mean, these are people that have worked with them out in the fields with both sides, in the villages, in Mozambique, in the countryside. They know, and they're friends. And he can sit down, Don Matteo can say to him, say, look, you know, come on, we gotta do this, you know. Just think of what we can get, how we can rebuild our country. And he did such a beautiful job when they were reluctant. The guy named Gabuza was in there for Chisano, and Domingos for Declama, and it was difficult. And we brought Hank Cohen over, our assistant secretary, and he sat down with him. He's a kind of a nice, friendly uncle type guy. Hank Cohen, very sharp. He wrote a good book about this too. But I'll never forget how he handled it. He was so good, Hank Cohen. He sat down with the Renamo and Frelimo, and you know, Frelimo said to him, we can't deal with this former sergeant, this Declama, this Renamo terrorist, the Domingos and these guys, you know, we can't deal with these guys. They don't deserve our respect. And we're not going to give them the authority to be an equal with us. You know, they don't deserve it. And he said, look, Cohen said to me, nobody's asking you to give them official recognition. We're just talking about these are going to be exploratory talks, right? Just like Connaught House on South Africa with the Brits in London. These are exploratory talks about talks, right? And the president will say, oh, okay, all right, maybe. I'm exaggerating, of course, my typical Coke humor. But, and so, and then that was part of it. And then also he said to him, and this was the most effective thing I ever heard, because we've been using all kinds of arguments with them on everything, on power sharing and how it works. And don't worry, if you don't win the election, if you just make a decent showing, which you will, then there's going to be a more open political system where you'll have press, you'll be in the parliament, you'll have a number of seats, and you'll be able to stand up on a podium, and the TV cameras will be broadcasting your message, your ideas, and the place is going to be a more open country, because we won't have any peace agreement if they don't agree to this. It's going to be a more open society, and so you'll get what you want over time. You know, you may not win it the first time, but you'll get there. And Hank didn't do it that way. Hank just came in and said to him, look, you know, we love you both. He said, look, you cannot expect a negotiation. You can't get everything that you expect. Just remember that one point. You can't expect to get everything you want.
Well, did they come together several times?
Yeah, 5, 6, 10 times maybe. I was at a few of those.
Who paid for that, to get him out of Africa and into Rome?
Well, I think the Vatican may have paid for him, but we may have helped.
Yeah.
I think we helped.
Well, when did you meet Pope John Paul? Or in the process?
Well, in one of those meetings where I was there, where we went to the Vatican, and the Vatican told us they weren't quite sure that the timing was right, that both sides were ready for peace. But the Vatican's very, very hard-headed about this. They're willing to do it, and they did it. But they said, we're just not quite sure they're ready yet. And we told them, we said, we think they are. Give it a try. And they said, okay. And I was there for some of these stations negotiating. I was just in the back bencher. Just, you know, I was carrying messages from Washington and back to Washington, bringing people from Washington, experts in to talk to them. We brought, my boss in was Robert Perito, which means expert in Italian. And we told the Italians, we said, in the Vatican, we said, we're bringing in an expert. And they said, oh, okay. So we showed up at the airport with Mr. Perito. And I said, here's Mr. Perito. They said, we know, but what's his name? I said, no, his name is Perito, Mr. Expert. They said, okay, all right. It was like, who's on third? So it was a funny story. But anyway, we, so I got to meet the 4 or 5 of us got to go in. We were working on peace, and so we got to meet the Pope at one of his audiences where he has a room full of a large number of people, and they took us off to the side, and they said to him, these are the people, because he was involved. John Paul II was involved. They said, these are the Americans who've been working on peace in Mozambique, and they gave him a lot of details of what we've been doing. So he came over, and you know, so we held out our hands as he came by, and he took, I remember took my fingertips in his hands, and he gave me a blessing. And I thought, wow, I still feel like I'm okay now. I had great respect for that.
Yeah.
So anyway, that was how I got to meet him as part of a peacekeeping group. And
so how long do you think that process took from when you thought it might be possible?
Yeah, from 88 to 92. I left in 91, and my good friend that I brought in to be my successor, Bill Jackson, was there until 92. They signed the agreement. They had to do a lot of work. They had to get the Red Cross. They had to get all kinds of people to set up zones during the voting where, you know, corridors of safety where neither side could have troops in those corridors. And it was a complicated process for elections. And it worked out well in the elections. That, you know, Frelimo won, but Renamo did pretty well.
Yeah.
And it worked out well. And I went back to Washington, D.C., and, you know, so I felt pretty good about that.
Yeah, good job.
But we, the United States had a lot of successes, like I say. You know, if you look at Camp David, if you look at Northern Ireland, you know, and all these places where we have done a great job. I mean,
behind the scenes.
And I'm always reminded of what Eisenhower said. And one time a Russian told me, he said, oh, you Americans, you're successful because you're powerful and you get what you want. You're determined. You won't let anything stop you. And I said, no. I said, you don't get it. I said, America is great because America is good.
Yeah.
That's what Eisenhower always said.
Yeah.
America's great because America's good.
Got to keep it that way.
Yeah.
Well, where we're at now is we're not only in May, where the declaration of war happened down in between us and Mexico.
Right.
in the first battles. But we now know who the new Pope is.
Yeah.
He's
Yeah.
from Chi-town. Good grief. But anyhow, I guess a kid who they thought would be Pope when he was 5 years old. That's like,
Is that right?
yeah. But I can't help but think that being an American is kind of a disability anymore, the way things are right now. But who knows? He might turn out to have some things up his sleeve. But we also know what the Victory Day parade was in Moscow. Huge flyover. President Xi from China was there. There were 100 Chinese troops with 11,500 Russian troops. Lots of missiles, lots of remotely piloted vehicles. But the thing that I found most important about that in the development of this whole thing with Ukraine is that some of the things Putin said. He talked about having a vision for Ukraine that was like almost spiritual, like Ukraine belongs to be part of Russia, which smacks of Peter the Great, but also of our manifest destiny that drove us across this country, you know, to do this stuff, you know, without even thinking twice about it.
Yeah.
And then the other thing he said was, well, we can do this with our resources. We won't have to use nuclear weapons. So still shaking that nuclear weapon rattle.
Like to do that.
And it looks like it's going to go on. And meantime, and the other thing I noticed was the staff, or the people in the universities that study this stuff in Russia, they know that I'm not changing. I mean, I might change a little, but Russia has got to show a lot of interest in doing things right in the UN and so forth. And before I change my colors on Russia, and I think they're playing Trump. I really do. And I think when President Trump realizes that, it might not be pretty. We'll see. But it's really clear that, to me, that the United States is not the right people to bring peace to Ukraine. And there needs to be a peace there somewhere. So I'm thinking this kind of a thing. I don't know who the person is. I thought that perhaps President Sheinbaum out of Mexico, I think her declaring the neutrality of Mexico, when Zelensky asked her to go to Ukraine, she said, no, I'm not coming, sorry. Our Constitution requires us to be neutral. And the same thing, they've got Russian soldiers in their parade, so they've pretty much demonstrated neutrality and to be a moral force. But I'm curious, that whole process, if the moral force was Pope John Paul, all that work being done in between, I wonder who would be doing that now with things the way they are. I mean, that's a lot of work.
Well, they've thrown a lot of names out there, people that might be able to do it, but I don't know. You know, Russia originally, Putin said the reason he was going into Ukraine was because NATO had expanded eastward. You know, he was being threatened. And because of the color revolutions, and we were taking advantage of a coup d'etat in Ukraine, and then also because he had to protect the Russian people who were being brutalized by the Ukrainian fascists.
And seeing us as Nazis.
So there's all these excuses, but now we're finding out that the real reason is that he wants to be Peter the Great, is what you're saying, right, John?
That's what I think. But, however, I had a chance to see Senator Mansfield from Montana just before he died, 4 months before he died. When I was at the Pentagon, I called over to his office. He was on Pennsylvania Avenue. And they said, come on over. So I went over to see Senator Mansfield for the first time in my life. And I couldn't believe it. It was great. But he says, one of the things, he was very terse. We had a great conversation. And he was getting ready to check out, but it was just before 9/11, and he said to me, he really felt strongly for a guy that, you know, doesn't come across that way. He was very adamant about NATO, and this was when NATO was back to just a handful of countries, and he had somehow gotten the information. This would be in 2001 in August, and he goes, NATO's becoming an offensive organization. He said, we put billions of dollars into that organization to make it defensive. And he's the first one that told me that he was concerned about how it was expanding. And I have to say that. and because NATO has expanded, and it has to have felt threatening to the Russians. And so when I mean, what he said was, how's this going to end? Well, now we're at the end of it. And so but that's a fact. He did say that, right. And it's an important point.
The other side of that, of course, is that you know, the countries that, like you know, Romania and with Moldova, and a lot of these countries that felt that we needed to include them in NATO for their own protection. And when you look at what Russia's done in Georgia,
yeah.
in Ukraine, well, maybe they're right. Maybe.
Yeah, they're not nice. And what they did in Bucha, I mean,
yeah,
they really,
yeah, that was terrible.
They got to clean up their act.
Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Renamo and the Russians got a lot in common.
Yeah.
So anyhow, I'm not sure where the people are going to come from to pull something like this together. I don't think it's going to be the United States. I really don't.
Well, I know it maybe end up being somebody like, I don't know who it would be, but maybe it might be the United Nations. There has been talk about Turkey at times, you know.
Yeah, Turkey's had a lot of play over there with both sides. Could be Turkey. Yeah, I agree.
But you know, it may like I said last time we talked about Russia, that, you know, as long as you keep talking, as long as we're talking to the Russians, and you never know that maybe Russia will decide that the war is too expensive. They're losing too many men over there.
Oh, they're losing a ton. I mean, the numbers are just staggering.
So yes, it's always possible. You never know. I mean, they can surprise you. I mean, like when Austria, with the peace treaty with Austria in 1955, when they let Austria go, right?
Yeah.
So you never know.
Well, yeah, it's really. You never told me any of this stuff when we were having beer in Belgium.
In Belgium, Battle of the Bulge.
Which reminds me now. Next week, next episode, which will show on Memorial Day here in the States, we're going to talk about the Battle of the Bulge. Randy and I got to know each other pretty well when we went to Belgium. We went to Brussels to do one thing and then out to Bastogne to do the other. And we wrote a book called The Battle of the Bulge from a Montana Perspective. And so next week we're going to break out the maps. If people did for our democracy what the men and women did during the Battle of the Bulge, 4 months before Hitler offed himself in a bunker, you know, they held out, they fought to the death. You can at least read episodes 3 or listen to episodes 3 through 30 of the Electric Bison. It'll give you an idea of these massive battles that happened. There were one here, one way up here, and you'll be impressed. And I think we owe that to the people that defended our democracy. So maybe we'll hear from you next week or see you next week. Thank you very much.
Thank you, John.